Namaste and wish you a very happy, harmonious, beautiful, progressive year full of peace and harmony and most important progress. Because the mother says there are two aspects of grace, one that brings peace and everybody wants that, and the other that brings progress, and that's what people don't want because people get stuck into comfort zones. So both we must aspire for peace and progress. Peace without progress is can often make us stuck, leave us stuck in certain fixed territories, and progress without peace can be a very turbulent thing. So peace and progress, and with that I begin this talk about Swaraj and Suraj. So literally Swaraj means self-governance. Swa is self and Raj, governance. And Suraj is good governance. Su, the word comes as, good, and Raj is governance. So it basically touches upon two aspects of human existence. One is what is self-governance, and second is that is the individual aspect, and the second is the collective dimension. How do we govern not only ourselves but all that is around us? So this was a term which Sri Aurobindo used during the freedom struggle. Much later, some of the things that he had used were picked up by those who came much later, maybe even a decade later. But basically, there were four things that Sri Aurobindo used, four terms or five things that he used during the freedom struggle, India's independence movement. And one of them was Swaraj, self-governance. The second was Swadeshi. The third was passive resistance. Fourth was boycott. And the fifth was national education. And each of these terms were had a very deep and profound significance, and we may or may not be able to touch upon all the terms, but we'll focus mainly on Swaraj. What did Swaraj mean? Now, ordinarily, we would think what is there to deliberate about it? A country has a right, its people have a right to govern themselves. What's the big deal about it? And like in modern times, we often look at it like that, well, if a group of human beings decide that they must separate, vote in its favor, and that should be the end of the story. It's almost like a self-determination by a group of people. Now, it's here that Sri Aurobindo brings a very different yogic, spiritual dimension to a nation. So, take an example of an individual when he engages in yoga. So, what does freedom consist of? Ordinarily, we think freedom consists that I do what I feel like. Well, if I feel like separating, I separate. If I feel like joining with somebody, I join. And that's the end of the story. But in the deeper spiritual sense, freedom means freedom from ignorance. That means I must first discover my true self. If I don't discover my true self, in that case, whatever freedom I may enjoy will always be temporary, always subject to all kinds of invasions. At an individual level, it would mean invasion by all kinds of forces. And at a third level, it would mean that I may completely be misled along my way, lose track, etc., etc. So for Swaraj, in fact, Sri Aurobindo has used the word Purna Swaraj, which later on became a very famous slogan, not just a slogan, but a mantra. So Sri Aurobindo used the word Swaraj in its triple sense. So he said there must be the spiritual freedom, there must be social freedom, and there must be political freedom. And the three must go together. So spiritual freedom is first and foremost, because then we discover what is the true self which should govern. And he gives a beautiful example of, the Indian subcontinent. He says, Swaraj can be understood in one way, which is how the then Congress people had understood it, that self-governance meaning thereby we are a colony and we govern ourselves. So there is basically the British government, which is like the overarching umbrella, but otherwise this is self-governance. Sri Aurobindo discarded this idea. He said no, because that kind of Swaraj doesn't make sense, because you continue to be a vassal state. So he spoke about Purna Swaraj, not just self-governance, but self-governance by the people in the way they wanted to govern it, which is a little difference. But here we see that what really happened down the course of history. So we became free, and yet we are governing by the methods which at one point of time the British had applied. One of them is being the Western system of democracy, and everybody goes vote. So all this Sri Aurobindo had discarded back then, but what he gave was something much much higher. So, but first thing important is that people must gain spiritual freedom if they want to really build a nation. But a spiritual freedom is not possible in a nation of subservient people. This was the logic. It's so interesting. He was using the freedom movement like a national yagna. So if you look at it, Sri Aurobindo, before the freedom movement, it's his individual yoga. The individual yoga becomes a national yoga. And the national yoga becomes a yoga of the world when he moves away from Pondicherry after doing what is required to be done. So we focus mainly on the national yoga. Like any yoga, the first step is to discover your soul. You can't be engaging in yoga with the ego self. The two don't go together. So the first requirement of any nation is the people of the nation, they must discover the national soul. If you don't discover the national soul, it's meaningless to talk about Swaraj. It will be, well, like the freedom of anyone who has the right to do whatever he feels like within the framework of law. And here Sri Aurobindo reminded us what really national soul is, what India is, and we see through several articles, essays, his talks, he was reminding us who we really are. So, and it applies to every nation that if we want truly Swaraj, then it's not enough just to be independent in the way we understand it, but the nation must discover its own soul. So this idea he later on develops, and we had several discussions on this topic, which is very fascinating. For each nation, the soul must be discovered. So this is Swaraj. But then, when it discovers its soul, how will it manage its affairs? So that's why Swadeshi. Swadeshi literally means I discover my methods of governing the people. So this is again very different from the way we understand that, and that is one of the problems. Now we see within India there are two parts that came out of India. One is India, what we call today is India, and the other is what we call as Pakistan. So why he was insisting on Swadeshi, he said that if people don't know how to govern themselves, and if they are governing themselves with the help of foreign aid, such a nation is bound to go down the spiral of degradation. Now it is so fascinating when we see today, I mean, of course we talk about India didn't heed the word of Sri Aurobindo. It's true to an extent, though now we see a reawakening. I wish Pakistan had heeded the word of Sri Aurobindo. Because he very clearly says that if a nation remains dependent on doles, even though it is basically free. Now Pakistan is a free nation. But is it really free? No, it is subject. It was for a long time subject to the American influence and the money, and now it is subject largely to the Chinese influence and money. Now he tells us that, well, if we remain subject, we cannot really be free. We cannot arrive at true freedom. And he gives an example, and I have found this so fascinating. Say, in an individual life, if I want to pursue yoga, I must first individualize myself. If I remain subject to all kinds of people on whom I am intellectually dependent, emotionally dependent, then where will in me be the strength to discover my own soul and stand by it? So the first necessity before we discover an individual soul or a national soul is to learn not to depend, but rather discover my own way, my own method. So this is where he speaks about Swadeshi. But Swadeshi cannot work unless there is simultaneously a rejection of all that is like a foreign influence. So there came boycott. So, and he went to the extent of saying that if we are Indians, we must rebuild ourselves the way Indian way of life works. And he speaks of it that dress in our culture, in the way of our life, because otherwise we'll never be able to either discover or express our soul. And here he gives the example of Japan, how Japan is an independent nation, very strong nation, but it went the Western way because it didn't realize that its soul has its own strength and it must rebuild this world according to its own soul strength. So India also, unfortunately, now we see all over the world this turn towards, this movement of discovering the nation's soul is a very interesting and important movement. So, but in India we see that while we got independence, it is a debatable thing whether we really got Swadeshi and Swaraj or not. because we are still so much under the influence of all that gets imported from the other part of the world. Now, again, Sri Aurobindo is not saying it's not valid. It's valid in a certain part of the world. They have to grow like that. For example, to just give two basic different paradigms, if we go to the western side of the world, we see that the way of life largely focuses on, let's say, governance. Good governance is about the people. So man is at the center. So the ideal of good governance is that human beings, they should be in reasonable comfort. They should have enough liberty and wealth to pursue their own life the way they want. There should be a basically umbrella of rule and law, which maybe through machinery, maybe through legislation, which keeps things in a certain kind of order. Now, this is the paradigm in which man is at the center, and to give to human being a good life is the principle of Suraaj, good governance. It's like if you give your people a good life, if you give them wealth, if you give them whatever their needs are, good education, good health, then it's called as Suraaj. But it completely misses the point. Because we may give all of this, and yet we may not give the people this ability, this capacity to discover their own freedom. And that's why political freedom was important, because so that people can discover their own pathways. Let's take the example of the Indian context. Now, when we speak about Western context, it's people-centered, man-centered. In the Indian context, the good governance was always centered around the divine. It's something very strange. People often ask that what is the difference between the Western concept of individuality and Indian concept of individuality. Rather, I was surprised when some people said, but in India we didn't have individuality. I said, no, we had individuality, but of a different kind. In the West, the individuality is centered around the ego. I have the right to do what I feel like, as long as I don't violate the law. Now, what happens with that? Because it's an ego individuality which is in ignorance, I find ways and means to bypass the law. I find loopholes in the law. Because ultimately it is my ego individuality driven by desire. And so we see the result is, I was sharing this, that how we have big companies and big brands where actual input, the actual cost is much less. But this, because you know how law operates. So we have discovered all the ways and means to look good. But basically it's still an expansion of the ego and desire. So what about India? In the Indian context, individuality, again, fiercely individualistic. We see some of the ancient Indian characters like feminine characters, Shakuntala, Sita, Draupadi. Forget about the male characters, which plenty we'll find. Fiercely individualistic, but centered around dharma. So basically in India, individuality meant the action, and good governance means that the law of dharma should prevail. Mother gave a very interesting remark about India, that India is the only country where the psychic law can and must prevail. And then she says, and the time has come to do it. So what is that psychic law? Psychic law is very different from mental rules. And one primary difference is, while mental rules and regulations focus so much on the external action, psychic law, dharma, looks at the inner motives. So a man may do a lot of, religious activities, charity, for example. Often the other day, somebody was telling me so much charity is done by so many people. I said, yes, but for different reasons. People engaging in charity as a service to the divine is very few. Many do it because of the aggrandization of the ego. Many do it to assuage the conscience of a robber, that I steal and then I do some charity. So dharma will not look at all these things, flatten them and look at them as one. Dharma is going to look into the heart of things, the real motive. And based on that motive, it governs the life. So when life is governed on the basis of inner motive, and what should be the motive in a land of dharma, Swaraj, it should be a motive which leads to the collective march of mankind towards a great divine consummation. That is the ideal of the Gita, which is known as Lok Sangrahart. So when we look at the Indian context is not about rule by the people, of the people, for the people, in ignorance. It is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, but for the greatest good of the soul of the nation. Now, the moment we bring that dimension, it means every human being or a person who is a national citizen, he must discover and become one with the soul of the nation. How to do it? So Sri Aurobindo brought in this fourth element, which was national education. The only way we can do it is through a national education. So he was for discarding completely the education which came from the British, not only because, we hear about Macaulay and all that, but he doesn't speak about that. He says because that education is suited for a certain kind of temperament. And actually, if I see, I've been brought up in a typical convent school, and with all due regard to the both smiling and serious sisters and their sacrifices, but I used to wonder that, when moral science was taught, this is not how I understood what is true and what is false and what is right and what is wrong. I learnt it very naturally by reading the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. But when I read a moral science book with black and white, it didn't gel with my understanding. But I can understand that reason looks at things only like that. Reason cannot understand unless you put things as black and white. So did the person commit a crime or he didn't commit a crime? But on what basis? Based on a certain action. So dharma is a very fascinating field, and that's of course a subject in its own right. But when we read some of these national scriptures, for instance, Sri Aurobindo speaks about Gita as a national scripture. So if we read the Gita, then the issue of what should be done and should not be done in a given circumstance, we have to keep in the background those wonderful divine qualities that we must always embody, and then we must engage into action. So it is something very fascinating and very beautiful. So in India, the land of dharma, it should be dharma which should engage in, we should be the basis of Suraaj. Suraaj just cannot be rule of the people, by the people, for the people, in ignorance, because then what happens? People, I don't know what happens in other parts of the globe, but more or less something very similar happens from what I have learned, what I have heard, is that people enact certain laws, pass certain bills, at least do lip service to gain votes. So they try to please certain groups, and we all know that that's not a system which is going to work in the new world order. It's going to collapse and crash because it's based on hypocrisy and falsehood. People proclaim one thing, they profess one thing, they practice something else. But that's not dharma. Though to a rational mind it may look okay, because people are provided with wealth. And there are n number of examples. So for example, again I take this example of Suraaj. Now we had the kingdom of Ravana. In Ravana's kingdom, everybody had lots of money. There was no dearth of money. And apparently people must have lived happily. It was the only kingdom which had the flying machine. That time Rama didn't have a flying machine, but Lanka had a flying machine, and the wealth of Kuber was with Lanka, the elder brother, and yet Lanka is destroyed. We see something very similar in the Trojan War with regard to Troy, whereas the word Suraj, the right kind of governance, is not spoken of with regard to Lanka, but with regard to Rama. And it's very interesting that in Rama's kingdom, it is described that what was characteristic about it is very nice half a doha by Tulsidas ji in Ramcharitmanas. I am sure Vivek Sinha would be remembering it by heart, but let me try to remember it. And it says, Daihik, Daivik, Bhautik Tapa, Ram Raj Kahune Vyapa. So all these maladies of different kind. Now when we identify the self with the body, we develop a civilizational structure and political administration only to cater to the bodily and the vital needs. So what happens when we govern like that? We deprive the deeper psychic and spiritual elements. So then what happens? There is drugs, there is pornography, there are all kinds of things, because there is no stress on these things. The stress is that because I identify with the bodily and vital life, therefore that must be looked after. But when I identify myself with my spiritual self and the psychic self, then the principle of governance would mean that the psychic and spiritual life is cultivated and developed. The other day I was, having a discussion with some people, and they were saying, we talk about India was so developed and all this. Not that I'm a big fan of talking all these things, but because what matters is now we have to take it forward. So he said, but there were no ventilators and organ transplant during that time. I said, yes, and you have to understand the context about it. And the context is very simple. While we have evidence of things like cloning, but we don't have so many emergency medicines in Ayurveda which will prolong life indefinitely. Why? Because Dharma taught us that, well, soul is on a journey through many life cycles. So prolonging life somehow through ventilators, through all kinds of drugs, this drip, that drip, this was never there as a concept. Once the divine mother's great-granddaughter Purnadi told me something very interesting. She said, I have observed something very interesting about India, that you are not afraid of death. To an extent it is true. And I asked her, I know it because in the army background I know that, why Indian soldiers can fight like this. It's because this idea of death as the end doesn't come. Because we know somewhere that death is the beginning of a greater life. Now, you see, this is dharma. This gets inbuilt into a civilizational structure. So, death is not something where you want to somehow prolong life by all kinds of things. We don't do organ transplant so much because we understand that, well, life itself is an organ transplant. When you take a new life, nature does your complete organ transplant. So, the lines along which a nation will develop will depend on what it identifies as its soul. And when Sri Aurobindo spoke about Purna Swaraj, he meant this, that India must discover its own soul. And to do this, it needs political freedom. Now, this is a difference. He is not saying that I want political freedom for the sake of political freedom. We have a right to self-determination and you have to go away because this is our land. This was the bogey that the Britishers were doing at that time, that you are also invaders. You are the Aryans who invaded and we are also invaders. So invader, bhai, bhai. This was the bogey. And Sri Aurobindo reminded, that's why he says, no, that's not quite true. There is a certain kind of ethos, a culture which is centered around the deepest understanding about what this land is. And this culture was widespread, up the Vindhyas, down the Vindhyas, far east, right to the far west to Gandhar, and all this area has been suffused with a kind of spiritual light, and therefore political freedom is necessary, because if we don't get that, we cannot practice what our way of life is. So meaning thereby, political freedom alone is not sufficient. It's important, and that's why Sri Aurobindo reminds us that there is a path India can take, and that is of, lot of industry and again, lot of military power, economics, the way the West has gone. It says it can take that. It's like a copy-paste formula. And it says you need all these things. But if we go that way of development, then we will go toward degradation and destruction. Because we have achieved independence and yet it is not really Swaraj. It is not the national soul which is governing a nation. So it's important for this kind of a double independence or a national renaissance and resurgence wherein each person in any nation, now Swaraj I'm talking about in the Indian context, must discover what really India's soul is. And then we must try to identify with it and express it. The mother gave a very simple formula. When somebody asked how we can help India. So she didn't say that, you bring a lot of money and all that is okay. It's a good thing if you do that. But the real thing is, she says, find your soul, love India, soul of India with your own soul. Unite with it. And that is the way you can help the nation. Then you will feel inside what is the direction everything in my life should take place. And in that case, the beauty of psychic law or the dharma is you don't need a written book outside as a rule book to be followed. Because when you do that, people find ways and means to bypass it. But you do it from within. See, that was the principle in Auroville, that no taxes. So people found it very strange. And some people do misuse. Even now they misuse. That they don't show their profits. But basically she said that those who earn much should be able to contribute more. And they should themselves feel the urge from within. Why? Because this is dharma. So this way we grow inwardly. So there was Swaraj, Swadeshi, boycott of all that is foreign. And he spoke about the dress, because all this is a package. So in fact, Sri Aurobindo goes on to say in one of his speeches on Swaraj, he says, well, I have to speak to you in English because that's the language which has, is best with me. I've been trained in that. But in India, when we, there are many people who don't understand English. If I speak in Bengali, many others won't understand. If I speak in Hindi, many others won't understand. So we have to find a language which can hold the nation together. And that was the reason why Mother spoke about Sanskrit as the national language. Because Sanskrit, it has roots which can be picked up in Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannada, of course Marathi, Hindi, all these. We can pick up these in Bengali, in Odia, you'll find these roots. So the importance of a national education and boycott. And then he spoke about the passive resistance. So this was also very important, because we will go through all kinds of, invasions, which are, now people don't talk about political invasions, because only the very crude people talk about political invasion. But there are still cultural invasions. There are invasions which try to capture the mind. There are religious invasions. There are all kinds of invasions. And one has to learn to resist it. How does one resist it? It's not necessary that we must aggressively resist. We simply refuse it. We refuse to accept that influence. So this kind of a passive resistance, so he gave a 5-fold formula for India's freedom, but actually if you look closely, it was the yoga of the nation. So first step was awakening the aspiration. We can be free, but we don't want freedom simply in terms of a political freedom. Now we see the difference between the two, just political freedom and engaging in yoga of the nation. This is of course a very well-known piece of history, but so much less understood. As I said, that why Pakistan is failing. It's failing because it has got independence, but it doesn't have freedom. It continued to remain dependent. It didn't practice Swadeshi. So at one point of time, to discover freedom or to have freedom from the British, there was our great freedom fighter, Subhash Chandra Bose, and he wanted to shake hands with Germany and Japan. And Aurobindo cautions that this is very dangerous, because if he comes in, people are believing that, these two countries will come and they'll say, very good, no problem, we'll liberate you, and after that go away. No, they won't go away. Then the nation becomes subject to another country. It loses its own soul. Even if they give you a kind of freedom, exactly what happened with Pakistan. Had at that point of time, grace would not have intervened. I personally feel it was grace that intervened and that plan didn't work out. Imagine if Germany and Japan, they came in India and they gave us freedom from British and told that, okay, doesn't matter, you have your freedom, but we are the one who will run your factories. We are the one who will supply you whatever you want. Manufactured product. Then India would have by now very badly crashed. And then we understand what is the significance of Make in India project. A country must be self-sufficient. A person who is practicing yoga, if he is living on doles, this idea of the old bhikkhu ideal, though that ideal of bhikshu, which was practiced in Buddhism and Jainism as an aparigraha, meant that you go to one home, ask one home for your, whatever you need, and don't take more than you need, which is quite a practice. And then that's all. One home for your need. If you get it, fine. If you don't get it, you have to forget about it. This was one kind of practice. But that is not the highest ideal. Ideal is you should be completely self-dependent. Independent in that sense. You should be able to earn. In Sikhism, that way, there is a very nice doctrine, spiritual doctrine. They say that your kamai, your earning, should be done with your 10 naks, meaning thereby all the fingers of your hands. You can't be just going to people and asking for money and then, creating a spiritual empire. It won't work out, because always you will be subservient to those who are giving you the money. In some way or the other, the mind will tend to become slave. In some way or the other, you will give a little twist to your doctrines, your teachings, to accommodate a whole group which is supporting you financially. And that's where we understand how beautifully the mother organized the Sri Aurobindo ashram. Completely an independent unit. It's not like it's making a lot of money, but for everything that is required, there is something in the ashram, where it be granary, flowers, fruits, whatever vegetables, pulses, and milk, dairy, and whatever is made, printing press, agarbatti. It's like a self-sufficient unit. It's important, because if you live on donations, of course donations come, that's a different matter. But donation should not start governing your, way of life. So we see that in some of these temples, there are people who donate. And I've seen in some seemingly very good temples. And it's so shocking, and not shocking anymore, but so amusing that, there is a name or plaque put there. It's so contrary to the spiritual teaching, that in spiritual teaching you have to forget yourself, discover your true self. But the person wants the plaque should be put there, and when somebody had offered money to the mother and for Golkund and wanted his name to be put, mother said, okay, put the name and put it on the floor. This was her way of saying. Another place where somebody offered some money and the mother crossed it and said, not accepted. And third instance where the money was offered and with lot of suggestions. And Sri Aurobindo said with his characteristic humor, accept the money, reject the suggestions. So Swadeshi is important. Because if you depend upon the other nations to support you, whether you like it or not, you will become in some way or the other dependent. So this is what we discover, that when Sri Aurobindo was teaching about Swaraj and Swadeshi, he was actually engaging in doing the yoga of the nation. So the whole nation had become a Yajnavedi, in which, and then another thing very interesting, he says if you want to build a nation, you cannot build a nation without sacrifice. So it was the Yajna. And he says this, there are few people who will do the sacrifice. Like any yajna. In yajna, there are some people only who will engage in sacrifice, who are ready to give the offerings. But everybody then enjoys the fruit. So he says there have to be people who are ready to do the sacrifice. Sacrifice is not tyag. Sacrifice is an entire process of purification, complete freedom from ego and desire, who are willing to work for the nation without the least trace of selfishness. He says it is these few people who will eventually win Swaraj for the nation. And then he very beautifully, that's this sacrifice has nothing to do with those sentimental killings, throwing a bomb on, the viceroys and going to assembly. And this is not what Sri Aurobindo ever advocated. He said this is a cheap sentimental thing. It doesn't win Swaraj. It only creates reactions, and very often very adverse reactions. Because it portrays you as a group of sentimental people who are just doing these, mosquitoes, these annoying things. He said, no, it should be something very strong. And that sacrifice which he demanded or expected the Indians to undertake is the sacrifice of the ego and selfishness to build a nation. And that's why I was so happy when the other day, one of the things of our present Honorable Prime Minister's talk, I must mention, he said, I didn't have the Saubhagya, the good fortune to die for India, but I have the good fortune to live for India. That is the spirit of sacrifice. And if we do that, and to the extent that Indians engage into it, it all applies to every nation for that matter. To that extent, the nation will discover its own soul and its true freedom. So there are many nations which have freedom, but they are not yet having Swaraj. Swaraj is that subtle difference between just having a political independence and having the deep spiritual freedom. Without that, and that is something which can only be cultivated through a kind of national education, through a kind of national awakening as to what that nation stands for. So in the Indian context, it is to discover the national soul. So with this little, I'll read something from what Sri Aurobindo writes. The meaning of Swaraj. The word Swaraj is a new word, but an old one. It is as old as literature and civilization. The meaning of Swaraj in our ancient literature is the spiritual condition of the soul which attains to mukti. So you see, there are politicians today everywhere, but let's say in any nation, who believe all that you need is that people should elect you. And therefore you can govern. And you should live within the framework of the law. No, that's not what is meant by a politician who governs the nation must be completely identified with the soul of a nation. Which means that he should have recovered his own soul, freed itself from the clutch of ignorance. It's a tall order, but then there is no other. So he says, Swaraj is this spiritual condition of the soul which attains to mukti. When the soul is independent of everything but itself, when it exists in the joy of its light and greatness, when it is mukt, that is Swaraj. And if you really look at it, all the whether it be politicians, industry, or any medical, engineering, software, God knows, so many sectors are there, education. Now, who is the person who can really build the nation? First condition, he should not be working for money. He should be working because it gives a joy to serve. Where will that joy come? Only when one has found the soul. Without that, we may have the best of systems and they are going to crash. There are always plenty of ways that a virus can be introduced into the system. People can be poached, as we know at some point of time, there was a brain drain. All this because people are looking for money. So, often when people have this discussion and they say, why people go away from India? Because, so the answer given is, well, they go away because India is not giving good. Now the things are different, but I'm saying at one point of time, because it was not treating its talent well in terms of giving it the recognition and money. My answer is different. As if those who are staying are not talented. It's a very blasphemous statement. No, they are, but they love the country. And they love and they are willing to undergo that sacrifice. Why they are willing? Because they have discovered, they have received some touch of the national soul. That's why they want to stay here. That's why they want to build this country. Not because they don't have better prospects outside. They have plenty of prospects come. I mean, I remember I was myself offered running into lakhs, some pounds and dollars going here and there. I said, no, that's not, I would have been born there, but this is what I'm here for. And here I must work selflessly. Of course, Sri Aurobindo says those who go out, they must think of the nation and bring wealth to the nation, because that's a yagna. In yagya, we need three kinds of things which go as ahuti. One is we need wealth. The second is we need the energy of tapasya. Somebody who is ready to do the tapasya. And third is we need not just wealth but other kinds of dravya. The material, the means, the intelligence, all these things. So these three levels one has to engage in building a nation and giving it the Swaraj. Swaraj means a nation has arrived at its splendor, or what it stands for, what it is meant to be. And that can only come when people are willing to engage in sacrifice. So some will sacrifice money, some will sacrifice their talent, their energies, capacities, and some will sacrifice all that they have. And that's what we see when Mother says the same thing applies in discovering the divine. That some give their wealth, some give their work, some give their life, some give their soul, some give all of themselves. And then she says, these are the true children of God. And others give nothing. And she says, whatever their value in the outer world, for the divine purposes, they are valueless ciphers. This education, this awakening is needed. We don't understand it. And that can only come when we understand that education should not be a job-centered education. Education should be a means to express who you are deep within, in the background of the nation in which you are growing. So there is a whole rehauling of national education. That's why we know Sri Aurobindo himself was that example. Such a lucrative job in Baroda. He left at the drop of an hat and came for a pittance to start the first national college in Kolkata. And then eventually even that pittance was stopped. But he saw it as important. He said the people must be taught how Indians have understood India. How, I was hearing that day that there's so much hypnosis that takes place. I mean, we always knew Earth is round. That's why we use the word Bhugol. I was hearing this and said, this is so wonderful. We see in India there is an almanac. This is just to give a little understanding, because in the American context we say when the solar eclipse is going to come, when is the moon eclipse going to take place, and NASA does the study or whatever astronomical data, and based on that it says, isn't it? That's how it is announced. But very few people know. I have consulted, I am sure some of us here, that in India there was an almanac as old as 5,000 years back. It was known as Panchang. Now people perhaps may not be knowing. It had all the dates in detail, what time there will be Surya Grahan, what time there will be Chandra Grahan, and to the accuracy to the minute. Till date it continues. No one knows about it. because we didn't care to popularize. And it is such detail about every day, sometimes in too much detail. But people were interested only in the Rashi column. What's my future going to be? But isn't it amazing how this science had developed in another way by the discovery of the spiritual self? It's a whole science because that can know things in a very different way. So that's why indigenous systems, which now we are seeing coming up in the Indian context, Ayurveda is suitable. Because if it works, but we have to discover what true Ayurveda is. Ayurveda is not about this disease and that treatment. But if you discover it, we really suit it because it's something which has grown indigenously in the soil. So these are the things, same with national education, the language, the medium of instruction, mother tongue, it's important. So all this he was reminding us, and he says, all dependence upon others is misery. All dependence upon ourselves is bliss. So Make in India is important. Because if we depend upon others, for some time it will look very nice. We pay the money and we get. But if we keep on doing it, you automatically see now this happens. It has very practical implication. Now in an actual war situation, what happens? You have bought chips from a country. You have bought certain infrastructure from a country. Now if there is an actual war, you are dependent. Now this is not to say that there is no interdependence in the world. Of course there is. At the same time, we must know that some of the most important aspect must be indigenous. Because then only a nation can really prosper. This is the fundamental truth. To get rid of Maya, bondage is the ideal of our ancient religion. It is the sole object of human existence, human life. And then he says, let us apply the word Swaraj to national life. The national soul desires a reformed life. The national self is our Swaraj. The history of the world teaches us that when a nation is dependent, it begins to decay. It begins to lose its power. It loses its strength. It loses its manhood. And lastly, it is broken to pieces and becomes weak and helpless. This is what history teaches us and what reasons tells us. And let me add, and we have not yet heard or understood this. The many nations, and there are nations which take great pride in making other nations a vassal state. It's the best way to finish a nation. We see what's happening in Africa now. The people who have pitched their tents and they're doling out help. What was happening in Sri Lanka, almost on the verge of that. What was happening in Pakistan. And so we should be very careful. This is not just to India, but to the world Sri Aurobindo is speaking. A nation does not depend upon itself but depends upon others. Therefore, it is an unsound, unhealthy and diseased condition. The end of a disease is death. And if the nation consents to that disease, it will decay and death is certain. Now here he is referring to education. If it depends upon another way of, even in politics, parliamentary system, it doesn't work for India because India can never accept that man is ultimately God. Man is God not because of what he is, but what he can become. So there is always this rider. Even now, the entire management of our country is in the hands of foreigners. We have become absolutely like fakirs. We have become dependent upon foreign food and guidance. The management of India is entirely directed by others. We have to look to a foreign nation for our life. And so therefore he reminds us that why boycott is necessary. If we have meager means, we learn to live with them. This is the principle of yoga. In yoga, if you have less, doesn't matter. You live with that. But you don't turn to somebody else for a kind of help. You live with the idea that whatever you need will come to you from the divine. And so he says, national education, the object of our educational movement is to establish self-government in India. It is an education which shall create Indians, not Englishmen, citizens of the Indian nation. This will prolong the life of India. Education in English schools and colleges has cut us off from our ancient strength. It is an education which does not fit our ancient strength. The education we receive is narrow, meager and incomplete. So this is so important because we cannot connect. There are so many. The other day, there was a group of students and someone asked them, And I'm sure many people are not aware who wrote the Mahabharata. Forget about reading the Mahabharata. Who wrote the Mahabharata. It's amazing the kind of... apart from Vyas, Valmiki and Kalidas, we are not aware of any great ancient Indian author. Even Kalidas would be an exception. Isn't it? So this is the kind of depravity, and Sri Aurobindo reminds us it should not be. And in the end, if you want to realize yourself, seek for yourselves. If you realize the Atman, the real self, you realize the Anatman, the not self. We don't want anything which is Anatman, and that is boycott. The principle applies to a nation. We have to recover our national independence, and for that, we want our nation realized. We want to realize our nationalism. It is boycott which leads to national self-realization, and it is the ideal of Swaraj. So we accept all that gives us that unique sense and spirit of what India is. It has such a variety and plenty. And he reminds us, if you have not the courage of sacrifice, self-sacrifice, then do not talk of Swaraj. If you don't want to sacrifice, if you want to lie in your armchairs and you think you can save your nation thereby, then you have no right to come forward. It is no use your coming in numbers. Swadeshi, boycott, Swaraj and national education are not at all immoral, illegal or unnatural. So even nowadays when nations are seeking, some certain nations want so-called freedom. But freedom from what? First get free from your own ego self. Otherwise, what kind of freedom it will be? We have seen the example of Pakistan actually. If one cannot be free from one's own layered self, then just allowing, okay, by vote you decide that a country becomes free. This is the most stupidest, foolest, the most foolish thought which modern mind seems to accept, that just by numbers you can start getting freedom. It won't be freedom. It will be either a complete destruction, degeneration, or else it will be ultimately another vassal state. So he says that this is the work of Swaraj. And finally, very powerful, we say to the individual and especially to the young who are now arising to do India's work, the world's work, God's work. So he always connects. No nation exists in isolation. When a nation rises, the world rises. The nation brings its own unique strengths. See, when Swami Vivekananda was asked what should be sent to India, education, things like that. No, we have enough brain and enough education. We need money. Very straightforward. He said, we don't need your jnana. You can keep the jnana, we'll give you. We'll give you jnana, which is what is happening now. But we need money. You have your strength is money. Let that money come as a yajna. See, this is what it means, that each nation brings its own strength to the world, and thereby it helps the world progress. So India has its own strength. So when India engages in national yajna, it helps the world, it helps the divine work upon earth. You cannot cherish these ideals. Still less can you fulfill them if you subject your minds to European ideas or look at life from the material standpoint. He's using them as synonymous. That the development of a nation is, you see, people take out all these happiness index and all this, I don't know, whatever it means. And it's amazing. Sometimes I just wonder that, people are walking on their heads, so what? There are plenty of people who believe it, take it as gospel truths. And based on that, they say that, well, the comfort level, the per capita income, this is still we are talking about that. Imagine that there is a nation which has very good per capita income, like what happened in ancient Lanka, Ravana's Lanka, not ancient Lanka. And yet it can be so destructive to the world. So it's not that. That is important, but that's not what determines the quality of life. And so, Sri Aurobindo reminds us, materially you are nothing. Spiritually, you are everything. It is only the Indian who can believe everything, dare everything, sacrifice everything. First, therefore, become Indians. Now, again, this nationalism will help the world because there is something uniquely Indian that India will offer. There is something uniquely French which France can offer. Something uniquely Chinese that China can offer. Something uniquely European, in Greek that Greece can offer. Something uniquely Italian that Italy can offer. Something uniquely British which Britain can offer. Something uniquely American that American can offer. This is how we should look at it. So here he is speaking of that first therefore become Indians, recover the patrimony of your forefathers, recover the Aryan thought, the Aryan discipline, the Aryan character, the Aryan life. Recover the Vedanta, the Gita, the Yoga. Recover them not only in intellect or sentiment, but in your lives. So, this nowadays people often discuss. I was floating this idea recently that India is not a secular country, nor a religious country. He said, what do you mean? I say, India is a spiritual country. That's how we should look at it. And Gita should be a national scripture. So people said there will be objection. Let there be objection. There is no. Gita is a scripture which teaches us how to live. And this is native to the Indian soil. It came up before any of these religions had come into existence, which would today object. It governed the existence of these people right from the time of Arjuna and Parikshit, right down to Jhansi Ki Rani. And even today, if you go to the Indian borders, border post, if I've been to some of these Indo-China borders, and you will see, as you climb up the stair, Nathula Pass, you will see at several places. Leh Ladakh also you'll see, Sikkim you will see those lines from the Gita. Somewhere it will be written, Na jayati rete vakadachin, the soul is immortal. And you go through that, and by the time you reach, you say, give me something, I want to take the challenge of life. Because this is how in India it has grown. Somewhere else it may grow another way. It is the spirit that is infused, which makes you one person, warrior, equal to what is called as 1 lakh. Simply because you are now not just governed by your own physical strength, but by your moral and spiritual strength. Recover them not only in intellect or sentiment, but in your lives. Live them and you will be great and strong, mighty, invincible and fearless. Neither life nor death will have any terrors for you. Difficulty and impossibility will vanish from your vocabularies. For it is in the spirit that strength is eternal, and you must win back the kingdom of yourselves, the inner Swaraj, before you can win back your outer empire. So it was Swaraj, then Samraj. So it was with this Swaraj, then you became Swarat, and Samraj was Samrat. So first it should be, that's why in India Samraj was built, empire was built on the basis of Ashwamedh Yagna. That was a Yagna. And Yagna meant that whatever kingdom comes with me, I'll share all this equally with everyone, for everybody's development. And then finally, there the mother dwells and she waits for worship that she may give strength. Believe in her, serve her, lose your wills in hers, your egoism in the greater ego of the country, your separate selfishness in the service of humanity. Recover the source of all strength in yourselves, and all else will be added to you. Social soundness, intellectual preeminence, political freedom, the mastery of human thought, the hegemony of the world.